13, sponsored by the Division of Student Affairs and Office of Student Life. This year we are particularly honored to share the stage with the Black Literature Series annual Read In. It was 150 years ago that President Abraham Lincoln penned the following words: "All persons held as slaves within our state or designated part of the state in rebellion against the United States are, and henceforward, shall be free." Our theme, the Emancipation, 150 years, celebrating liberated minds, free spirits, and healthy bodies, is designed to use this defining moment in the American saga to encourage all in attendance to reflect on the rich history of the peoples of the African diaspora, those of African descent, and the contributions made by our dogged determination and indomitable spirit. Additionally, we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, led by the prominent African-American personage who took emancipation to new heights and in service of all people, Dr. Martin Luther King. The presence of people of African descent has played a key role in moving these United States towards a more perfect union. The most recent event took place on January 21st, 2013. That momentous event demonstrates what happens when we treasure our freedom in mind, our freedom in spirit, and our respect for our bodies. The time we spend together today will be a time of reflection, introspection, celebration, and a call to action that we may forever treasure freedom and use our talents and our gifts in the service of others. Ladies and gentlemen, the Black National Anthem. pleasure to bring before you two of LaGuardia's finest students who are going to serve as mistress and master of ceremonies for this program. Help me with a warm welcome bring to the stage Elena Chisholm and Quasi Solomon.
Thank you. My name is Elena Chisholm. I'm the current Governor of Academic Affairs representing the Student Government Association.
Hello everybody, I'm Quasi Solomon. I'm the Music Club President, and today will be Madam the Master of this ceremony.
Now, our next guest that we'll be introducing, he is a true pioneer for the student success and the success for everybody in the LaGuardia community. Just as many of those who have struggled through the triumphs and the obstacles for many of us to be here where we are today to enjoy the many freedoms that we have, is Mr. V.P. Baston.
Saw in a very moving way. Really, the struggle, the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of people of African descent on these shores. I must say that I'm inspired because we see an American story of people of pride and dignity, people who have done great things in the midst of freedom's journey. As we commemorate this 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, I need us to understand today that inequalities still exist. There are still many things that we must overcome. There is still a need for young people around the world to emancipate themselves. And education is your way to emancipate yourself, to liberate you and your families and those who will come after you, those who will stand on your shoulders. Let us mark this time to celebrate and commemorate our great heritage. Let us not forget that we too have a responsibility to be a link in the chain. We have a responsibility to learn, to grow, to share, to care, to make this a great world for those that will come after us. This is not simply Black history. This is the American story. The music, the food, the culture, the intellectual contributions, all of them belong to all of us as a sacred trust. If we don't keep hopes and dreams of our foreparents alive, if we don't share this history, if we don't continue to make history, then we cannot emancipate the world. Now, this is a time of reflection and celebration. For all of you that have worked so very hard, the faculty, the staff, the students, we celebrate your efforts. And we thank you who have come to bear witness to this great day. Be a part of the continuing liberation of our minds. Thank you so very much.
Now we have another guest, and it was once said, without a struggle, there can be no progress. The speaker of those very words was Frederick Douglass, the father of the abolitionist movement. Now, with us, to join us in the struggle for us all to have success in the future, ensure success, whether it's Black, white, Latino, Hispanic, or Asian, we have Ms. Renee Butler. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have to say, following Vice President Baston is no simple feat. I first want to acknowledge the members of the committee, Andrew Russell, Astrid Nieblas, Jeffrey Kaz Bass, Irene Sosa, Kevin Jordan, Marina Provakovic, Nilda Solis, Perrion Malik, Renee Fuzzy Moore, Sonia Evaristi, Stephen Hitt, Terry Tidwell, and Terry Parker. I want to just acknowledge the hardworking crew. So yesterday would have been Rosa Parks' 100th birthday. And this year marks 150-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment that denounced slavery and was the point of contention to bring the Civil War to an end. President Lincoln knew that by signing the Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves from the Confederacy, he would change the nature of the war, to no longer be a war about preserving the separation of the states, but it would be a war to end slavery. He knew that he would dissuade Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. He knew that this would allow slaves to be recruited into the Union Army so that they could fight for their own freedom. 2 amendments were later passed to address discrimination against slaves. The 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. It was also forbidden for states to deny a person life, liberty, and property without the process of law. The 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3, 1870, which prohibited discrimination of the right to vote on the basis of race. While much work was left to do, and this was just the tip of the iceberg, 100 more years would pass before the USA would be forced to recognize that the Emancipation Proclamation did not truly free African Americans in this nation. But the 13th Amendment paved the way for the abolition of slavery in the USA. And the issue of racial discrimination was placed on this nation's consciousness and in the forefront of the nation's issues in the 1960s, when Martin Luther King inspired millions to fight for their rights. And it set the tone and the stage for changes in the immigration policy. Freedom. Being free to move about unhindered and unrestricted within the context of the laws, the policies, and the rules of the society and the community in which we live. Do we all feel free? Do we all feel that we have the same freedom to move about this world without fear or feelings of restriction? This is the freedom that the 13th Amendment serves to protect. Freedom. What does it mean to be free? Can you be free from physical bondage and still not be free? How we think, feel, perceive our interactions, our experiences shape our lives and determine how free we are to embrace or question our beliefs and values, what we learn and are told by those we respect. Do we allow preconceived notions, our biases and judgments, possibly rooted in uninformed, questionable information to shape our thinking, our choices, and our decisions? Each of us are responsible for how we respond to the conditions, events, and occurrences in our lives. How we choose to view our world can determine how free or not we are. How we choose to view our circumstances and respond to situations can determine how free or not we are. We have the power to free our minds from self-doubt and become self-actualized. We have a responsibility to be critically engaged in making our communities, the nation, and the world a better place. An unknown author said it best: liberty is the right to choose. Freedom is the result of that choice. Thank you.
Very moving speech. Our next guest who will be reading A Raisin in the Sun is named Mr. Jason.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Jones, and I'm the co-chair of the Black Literature Series Committee from the English Department. We are very honored that the African American reading is part of today's program. It is a national event sponsored by the National Council for Teachers of English and was created to promote the reading of African American authors during Black History Month. Today's reading has been broken into 3 sections. The first section, we will hear an excerpt from Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. The second section will focus on readings on freedom and resistance, and the last explores issues of identity. And with that, I would like to welcome Professor Lacey's LIB 200 class, who will be reciting from A Raisin in the Sun.
Walter Lee Younger speaks.
Well, me and my family, well, we are very plain people.
I mean, I have worked job for most of my life.
And my wife here, she does domestic work for people's kitchens.
So is my mother. I mean, we are plain people. And, well, my father, well, he was a laborer most of his life. And my father almost beat a man to death once. Because this man told him a bad name or something. You know what I mean? Yeah, but what I mean is that we come from people who had a lot of pride. I mean, we are very proud people. And that's my sister over there. She's going to be a doctor. We are very proud.
But I'm telling you this, that we called you over here to tell you.
But we are proud and that this
This is my son, and he makes the 6th generation of our family system.
We have all thought about your offer.
And we have decided to move into our house.
Because my father,
he earned it for us by
We don't want to make no trouble for nobody, or fight no causes. We will try to be good neighbors. And that's all we have to say about that.
How's everyone doing today? Are you enjoying the program? Can we get a round of applause? is the founder of the African Heritage at LaGuardia since 2005. He is the person most responsible for this dedicated program to the Emancipation Proclamation. He is a staff personnel that goes beyond his job description just to empower students. I would like everybody to give a big round of applause to Kazambi Back.
Good morning, everybody. History is important. History is very important. That's why we're doing this event. The history of our struggle as a people, Africans in America, the history of the struggle here at this college. And so I'd like to give a shout out to some of the professors who, in 2005, helped start the African Heritage program here at this college. Professor Terrence Julian, give him a hand clap. He's no longer there. Dean Sandra Watson, give her a hand clap. She deserves it. Professor Eleanor Tigner. There are a few people still on campus who worked with me in the very beginning. Give a shout out to Terry Parker. Give a shout out to Victor Rosa. And I don't see him in the building, but give a shout out to Louis Merchant. And last but not least, please give a shout out to Irene Sosa. So, as I said, history is important. The history at this college, history period. You know, Dr. Muhammad, who's about to address you should know that you're coming into a space that since 2005 has been cherished. We've had people such as Wycliffe John, Regent Emeritus Adelaide Sanford, news reporter Cheryl Wells, the late Gil Noble, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who you saw in the video. So when you touch this mic in a couple of minutes, I know you're going to live up to the tradition of sharing and speaking truth to power. And when we say speaking truth to power, I remember a couple of months ago I had an opportunity to do that. I was speaking to the dean about the importance of Emancipation Proclamation being celebrated at this college. And we're going to celebrate it today. We're going to learn a lot about that. So that's a beautiful thing. Slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, black power. We have a lot to learn, to study, so that we don't have to repeat some of the dark past that we've had as a people. We need to study everywhere, every day, including at LaGuardia, African Studies, Black History. Father, educator, activist. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together as he comes to the stage, the Executive Director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Honorable Dr. Khalil Muhammad.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was a very robust introduction to high expectations, shall we say. I want to thank all of the people who have worked very hard for me to be here today to make a few adjustments. I know that for those of you who come out, this is an important part of your experience of being college students. I remember for most of you in the room being in college and celebrating King Day on campus for the first time back in 1989, or participating in Black History Month events. It felt like grown-up people stuff. You know, it felt like it was not quite class. It certainly wasn't church. There was no mom and dad around to make me be there. So it was this moment of really paying attention to issues and moments and social themes that were about being an adult and about being engaged. So I want to applaud you for the commitment that you've made to be here. You're on your way. You're on your journey. And keep your eyes on the prize, as they used to say in the Civil Rights Movement. I want to thank, of course, Kaz, Mr. Batts, for his support of me, his support of the Schomburg Center. He's a regular there. And I want to encourage you, if you've never been, to make your way to 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard, right across the street from Harlem Hospital. The center's been there a long time, we're approaching our 9th decade. It's one of the oldest cultural institutions in the city dedicated to the global Black experience, but it's most certainly one of the last remaining physical structures that have been there, that has been there since the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s when the Schomburg Center began. It first started as a research branch located at 135th Street, just between Lenox Avenue and Frederick Douglass Boulevard. It's a lot of history up in Harlem, so. But that's important because institutions matter. They are the physical manifestation of the dreams, the hopes, the aspirations of people who wanted to leave a legacy behind, wanted to leave a trace of their many footsteps of the contributions they had made. So that institution needs you as much as you need it. Become part of it, support it, celebrate it, leave a little bit of your own legacy there. That's what we represent, and that's why it's so important. I want to thank Vice President Michael Baston. I want to thank Dean Renee Butler, both of whom spoke extremely eloquently about the importance of today, about the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the unfinished journey of freedom and equality in this country. I want to thank the amazing masters and mistress of ceremony, Kwasi and Elena, for their cheerleading, for getting us excited about what we're doing. I want to thank the students who participated in the reading of Lorraine Hansberry's play, Raising in the Sun. If you've not seen the play, you should try to, and we'll certainly read it. So don't start with Puff Daddy's version of it. Okay? To the original. The Schomburg Center, for example, has Lorraine Hansberry's papers as part of our collection. So for those of you who are budding literary scholars and who want to get to see what the work of a playwright and novelist looks like when it's in its raw form, when it's in the process of being created, you have every right to come to the Schomburg Center and ask to see that collection and to spend some time with it. So I encourage you to do so. And then finally, I want to thank all of the many committee members who have worked very hard and passionately to make today possible. I really like the sub-themes that you've attached to this, liberating minds, free spirits, liberating bodies. I think that's really smart. The Schomburg Center may be borrowing. So LaGuardia will help us think creatively about how to inspire people. Let me turn now to my address. I want to say from the start that the takeaway point in this, because I want to make sure the young people hear me clearly, the takeaway point here is that history and historical literacy are crucial to citizenship. They are crucial to being a citizen not just of the United States, but a citizen of the world. If you don't own your own sense of history, and history is infinitely debatable, there is no one narrative that captures the absolute truth of what happened, which is why it's so important. Your parents and your parents' parents' generations not only experienced life differently than you do, but the history that they inherited, the history of enslavement in this country, for example, that they learned is different than the history that you'll learn today. And it's because history is always a work in progress. It is always competing interpretations, not simply because we keep going back to the records and making things up. It is a constant work in progress because history helps us understand our present. And our present is different than your parents' past and different from your grandparents' past. Whether you come from the Dominican Republic, whether you come from Puerto Rico, whether you come from El Salvador, from Canada, or from Senegal. History has to be the starting point for all of you to understand where you fit in this world. And if you don't own it, if you don't own that journey, someone else will for you. So I'm going to share with you my take on the Emancipation Proclamation. You don't have to own it, but hopefully I will provoke you enough so that you will do your own study and you can own your version too. And you may agree with me on some points, and I hope you do. As the former professor of history at Indiana University in Bloomington, I spent a lot of time teaching, engaging, and trying to provide historical scaffolding for young people, for my students, so that they might be inspired to pay attention to the past. It is often a matter of life and death. Let me open then with a sense of the moment of emancipation, the character of those who experienced this moment, and a little bit of the texture and flavor of what that felt like for those who actually could celebrate on January 1st, 1863. There was an eager, wandering crowd of freed people in their holiday attire, with the gayest of head handkerchiefs, the whitest of aprons, and the happiest of faces. The band was playing, the flags streaming, everybody talking merrily and freely, strangely happy. Our hearts were filled with an exceeding great gladness, for although the government had left much undone, we knew that freedom was surely born in our land. It seemed too glorious a good to realize this beginning of the great work we had so long prayed for. That was from Charlotte Fortin, who was a black woman educator, who would go on to help educate thousands of young people in the wake of the end of the Civil War, giving testimony of what she observed at the 1st Regiment located at Camp Syston in South Carolina. Bishop Henry McNeil Turner talked about what he observed in Washington, D.C. the day that emancipation came. He said, men squealed, women fainted, dogs barked, white and colored people shook hands while songs were sung. You see, this has been a long-running moment of celebration, of commemoration, of memorialization, even at the very beginning. Part of what's not captured in those brief snippets of what people who lived in that moment observed was that emancipation itself had long been a work in progress. It had started first in the very first efforts of Africans to interpret their presence in the United States, not then called the United States, but called colonies, to interpret their presence as men and women who were there to reinvent themselves in spite of the fact that they had come in chains. They wanted to reinvent themselves as indentured servants from Europe had tried to do by establishing basic, decent humanity in the wake of enslavement. The very infrastructure of slavery had to adjust to their dreams and aspirations from the very beginning, including the right to marry whomever one wanted to marry, including the right to fight for land that was then unsettled, including the right of assembly and religious expression, pairing people of African descent with indigenous people known to us today as Native Americans. Those associations were born out of their desire to make the most of a situation. But what came in the wake of that, what came forth from those aspirations, was a series of laws that were passed to constantly conflict and constrain, to narrow the scope of freedom. Let me give you just a couple of examples. The reason why it wasn't until 1968 that the Supreme Court overturned illegal interracial marriage in the United States of America in Loving versus Virginia was because at the very first moment of this motley band of people, even for white folk who had come from far away, some who were destined for Australia to be convicts under the King of England, but instead were given an opportunity to be indentured servants in the new colonies. For those people, like those Africans who had traveled across the Atlantic, they naturally expressed affinities of friendship, of shared humanity, sometimes leading to unions. The first blow against their humanity was to determine who one could marry by race. The second blow was that as a consequence of interracial unions, first I'm talking about the consensual ones, then the forced rape of black women produced children. And so the entire world as we knew it of European culture, which determined the culture of the United States in its earliest days, and dictated that any child born to a woman would carry the status of the father, but not in these new colonies. By the late 17th century, the laws had been turned upside down because the progeny of those who were enslaved had to remain enslaved. And since white men were increasingly embodying the category of freedom, it was much simpler to say white man free, black man enslaved, white woman slightly less free, black woman more enslaved to the realities of sexual violence as well as the brutalities of physical enslavement. So they turned the world upside down, not because they were genius, they turned the world upside down because of the way people express their humanity. Right here in New York City, where 20% of the population in the 1700s were Africans, were people who participated in the daily commerce of this city. They were not free. But this was not a plantation economy. This was a market-based economy, which meant that people who were technically the property of others had to conduct transactions in their daily travels. They had to run errands. They had to sell their employers' wares, their property owners' food and clothing. They could speak and talk on behalf of those who ostensibly owned them. There was so much mobility in New York during this time period that rising fears of two or more gathering could lead to nefarious plots to take over New Amsterdam. And indeed, in 1712, some of those fears came true. even to this day, we are not entirely sure what happened. But what we do know is that out of the shared expressions of humanity, also in this case, of lowly European immigrants, those of Irish ancestry, working and living among enslaved Africans in New York, a so-called conspiracy to kill whites was uncovered and led to a mass execution of blacks. Out of that came a series of the harshest slave codes anywhere in the colonies, prohibiting gatherings of 3 or more, whether it was for religious worship, whether it was for leisure expression, hanging out, prevented them from moving about the city on horseback, because horseback was considered in that time a threat because it would allow a kind of extra form of freedom and movement across the city that was not easily policed. If you think stop and frisk is a problem today, which it absolutely is, this was its origin. This was the beginning, precisely, and this is the point that I want you to understand, because of what people were doing, even in the midst of being enslaved. New laws should always be understood and recognized in relationship to the behavior that is driving the necessity for those laws. The movement of black people in colonial New York led to the harshest slave laws in the country. And eventually, over time, the presence of antebellum black folks who gradually freed themselves or were manumitted changed the conversation in this nation about enslavement. The problem is that the rural South, based on an agricultural economy, had a greater economic incentive to hold on to slavery. But as you all know, between the end of the slave trade in 1807 and 1827, almost every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, every state that we would consider part of the North, gradually abolished slavery. And that was itself a reflection of the inability to maintain, to bottle that humanity. But the realities of antebellum blacks in the South during this time period continued to press against the conscience of those who had once freed themselves. Many of you have heard Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech from 1852, perhaps one of the most expressive criticisms of the contradictions and hypocrisy of a nation that claimed the birthright and mantle of being a beacon of democracy, the first modern republic that the world had ever known, throwing off the yoke of monarchy that its past in England represented. And yet, and still, the vast majority of those who were enslaved stood as a constant reminder, nearly 4 million people by 1860, that freedom for some was built on the denial of freedom to others. There is a contemporary lesson in that. There is a lesson for our time in that. There is something to learn about the relationship between freedom for some and unfreedom for others in our contemporary moment. But since we're out of college, let you hear what Frederick Douglass said, just a small, tiny quote, because I don't want to take for granted that you've all heard him before. He delivered this speech in 1852 after 7 years, I should say, from the publication of his Narratives of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, the most read black author of his day. and the most prolific abolitionist writer of the period leading to the Civil War. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and holy alliance, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. You see, Frederick Douglass knew, because he had been freed since 1838, he had freed himself since then, that freedom was not enough. That the antebellum project of freedom had proven insignificant to the reality not just of the life of Frederick Douglass, but to the lives of many freed blacks who still lived under the constraints of a nation who marked race with servanthood, race with inequality, race with the stigma of being less than. Abraham Lincoln, who of course we celebrate for his presidential leadership, we celebrate for the moral courage that he demonstrated in the face of fierce attacks by opponents who could not imagine any reality in America where all people of African ancestry would be set on an equal footing with their white counterparts. But the road to Abraham Lincoln's own moral righteousness was also a choppy road. It was also a road that went through many second guesses about what freedom for black folk would really look like. Abraham Lincoln had always opposed slavery, even as a young man, long before he found himself in the position to lead the United States. But opposing slavery was a moral choice rooted in a universal understanding that slavery was an abomination to Christ and a degradation of those who did the enslaving. So in relation to one's maker and in relation to one's own racial group, one's own sense of identity, for Abraham Lincoln, slavery could not stand. But as a political matter, Abraham Lincoln was deeply respectful of the laws of the nation. Do you know people today, for example, who object to certain inequalities, certain manifestations of poverty or injustice, substandard housing, bad schools, but are deferential to the laws? Who say, well, the laws say this. Well, that was the world in which our Abraham Lincoln operated in. The laws protecting the property of slaveholders, in his mind, as a constitutional matter, prevented him from freeing the slaves. And in fact, he had no intention upon taking office of changing that reality. He hoped over time to persuade those who had planned their futures and staked the claim to slavery in perpetuity, including the border states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Delaware, and of course the Deep South, which later became the Confederacy. He hoped to convince them that the future of America was not slavery. But he failed repeatedly. Let me give you a little sense of the drama leading to the Emancipation Proclamation, because I think it's revealing of the work left undone. Abraham Lincoln decided in the summer of 1862, in July, for example, to draft a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And partly his thinking was that the Union forces had suffered tremendous losses in 1862. But he had a bigger problem than just the losses. Ever since the war had first erupted, a number of enslaved men, women, and children had freed themselves at the first sounds of war, volunteering themselves to join not an army to preserve the Union, but as many said, armies of liberation. Just as their forebears had done in the 17th century to make common cause with degraded European indentured servants that produced a series of laws, to make common cause with Irish immigrants in New York that produced a series of laws, so too did black folk in the South make common cause with Union soldiers in an effort to defeat the Confederacy. There were so many black folks joining Union armies, unwelcomed essentially by those Union armies because they were a burden on the soldiers who were there to fight, not to take care of refugees, that from the field we began to hear, the president began to get telegrams and messages saying what to do with the men, women, and children who have joined our side. We cannot simply turn them back over to our enemies. Now, why would you say that? Was it just their sheer humanity? Were they anti-racists in addition to being Union soldiers? Some were, some were not. But what they knew was that these black folk, who they had now come into a real connection with, this was not an abstraction. These were real people in their faces. Those people knew the South. They knew their white folk. They knew where their supplies were. They knew where their vulnerabilities were. They knew the landscape of the South in ways that Union soldiers from far away in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois and New York did not know. They were also able-bodied in a community of soldiers fighting who were wearing thin. As I said, they had lost some significant battles in 1862. So if you think about the combination of fatigue behind Union lines, the confusion and unknowing of where the enemy actually was, and now you have these able-bodied, energetic people saying, "We have reported to duty, sir. We want to fight to free ourselves. We want to fight to change the laws of this nation." Some of those generals sent word back and said, "Suit them up." What does Obama say? Fired up and ready to go? Some generals said, "We cannot tolerate this," and sought measures to get rid of what was then called contraband. Well, that didn't work. That contraband grew in number, and that began to weigh on the president's mind. The necessity for the support of that contraband to the Union cause grew with every passing day. But let me lead you to this point. That was still not quite enough to get us to this uncomplicated sesquicentennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. Because it was uncomplicated, or I should say it was complicated for Charlotte Fortune. What did she say? The government has still work to do. What is complicated by this moment, for all the compelling reasons that I've just described, the president, right up until the very moment of the issuing of what became known as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, that document simply stated in unequivocal terms, and is indeed the document for which we heard tonight. The Emancipation Proclamation has slightly different language about freeing the slaves. Simply said to the Confederacy, in 100 days, if you don't lay down your arms, every enslaved person will be henceforth now and forever free. That was issued on September 22nd. Right up until September 22nd, Abraham Lincoln had spent nearly every waking moment trying to convince the border states to agree to voluntary, gradual emancipation. He also hatched up other schemes, including colonization plans. He sent a diplomat down to Haiti with $250,000 in 1862, looking for a colony to settle freed blacks. Because what Abraham Lincoln could not see, even in that moment where he would meet his historical destiny, was the reality of black, white, together, kumbaya. He couldn't see it. Because he believed, like the vast majority of whites, that black people were fundamentally unequal with whites, in spite of Frederick Douglass's amazing brilliance and so many other lesser-known abolitionists, Sojourner Truth just being one example. Or Phillis Wheatley, who by then was the greatest known black poet in the world. Abraham Lincoln was unwilling to demand that the basic infrastructure of equality be set in motion because of the Emancipation Proclamation. His hand, in this respect, as Lerone Bennett once said, was forced to glory. That's a complicated version of Abraham Lincoln, because the truth is, he transformed and evolved from the moment of the Emancipation Proclamation, finally issued on January 1st, to his fight for the 13th Amendment on 1865 that ultimately cost him his life. He transformed. He evolved. And in that evolution, we must take stock of the difference between where he was in 1860 and 1865, because if we just sit here today celebrating where he ended up and not seeing where he began, not seeing his own complicated journey, his respect for the Constitution, his deference to the laws. We have a Second Amendment, for example, right now that we seem, in my opinion, this is my interpretation, to be far too deferential to. We have a Supreme Court that has interpreted a Constitution that stars, where are my English teachers here, with a dominant clause predicated on militias, not individuals. And yet, in these times, we have a Supreme Court that essentially has signed off on a very conservative view of the purpose of the Second Amendment, which is that all of you have a right to bear arms. Bear arms in defense of what? Because most of those guns are not being used for anything but harm to the people who own them and harm to young people in our society. Abraham Lincoln knew that the Bill of Rights was insufficient to the task of making real, as he transformed, the possibilities of equality. Because guess what? The Emancipation Proclamation that we celebrate in this moment, one, had very little in the way of provisions for securing freedom. Any one of you taking the liberties of California and Colorado's and Washington State's liberalization of marijuana laws? Any one of you just anticipating the future that one day New York State might join the same? Well, you don't have to admit to it, but if you do, the reason why you aren't in trouble, paying a summons or dealing with a misdemeanor in the Kings County Court, is because the enforcement provisions are very difficult for that kind of behavior. Well, the same was true for freeing the slaves. But the other point they called on the 13th Amendment was, who's to say that the next president would not simply take away the proclamation? His own executive order. And not to mention that in the border states, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody. They were still enslaved. We must know that complexity. You must own that complexity, because in that complexity will you find the source, the strength, the inspiration, the ability, and the wherewithal to tackle your own contemporary challenges. If this is about liberating your mind, History is your laboratory. It's the place where you get to explore and put yourself in the middle of these great moral questions and say to yourself, what would I do? Who would I model? Whose footsteps would I fall behind? You know who else had a deep and passionate reverence for the past? I'm sure you can already figure out where I'm going with this. I mean, who else would I talk about in this moment but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Dr. King had a deep and passionate respect for the past. He wasn't just a silver-tongued orator. He wasn't just a well-pedigreed and credentialed young man with big dreams of what he could do from the pulpit of a Baptist church. He had a deep respect for what those who defined themselves as change agents in society. He had studied the social gospel movement of the progressive era, when ministers around the country left the comfort and coziness of their sanctuaries to go out to not just proselytize to the least of these, but to help them. There is a difference. And so Dr. King spoke eloquently and passionately across his long period of activism, but his short life, about the importance of historical literacy. Let me share with you one particular quote, because it's not something that we hear from King. It's not a version of King's commitment to the past that helps us appreciate part of his legacy. He said in Why We Can't Wait, which was published right after the I Have a Dream speech in early 1964, he says, quote, "The pale history books in Harlem and Birmingham have told how the nation had fought a war over slavery." Aren't we still talking about it? This was King's own ownership of the past. His own appreciation for what had happened in slavery. He hadn't been born in slavery. Let me take a little side note here. How many instructors, professors, adjuncts in the room? Raise your hand. How many times have you taught something and the students from the past, and the students saw knew the subjects in the story? They just had completely collapsed time. So Lorraine Hansberry, for example, you're reading that play and thought that you could go out and interview her and that she had passed away. Well, this happened to me a lot. Students have very little appreciation for time. And they collapse ideas into very narrow spaces that don't respect the fact that time matters. So it's important to know that King was, for all intents and purposes, as far away from slavery as you are in this room. He was born in 1929. That was a lifetime away from slavery in his mind, 75 years before. So you're no different in your sense that somehow this past is the past, it should stay in the past. What does it really matter? We got grades to get, work to do, money to make. But it was precisely King's commitment to understanding the past that propelled him to see in it lessons that he had to learn and those he had or needed to convey. Listen to this quote. "The pale history books in Harlem and Birmingham told how the nation had fought a war over slavery. Abraham Lincoln had signed a document that would come to be known as the Emancipation Proclamation. The war had been won, but not a just peace. Equality had never arrived. Equality was 100 years late." He used that moment not as an occasion for applause. He used that moment as an occasion for reflection about the limits of the Emancipation Proclamation. Where are we today? What would King say today about the world that we had inherited, that you as young people will come into the fullness of your ownership, whether it's next semester, next year, 3 years from now? What would King say of this moment, of the work that remains? Dr. King did not let aspiration and hope get ahead of the facts on the ground and a commitment to dealing with them. In one of his final texts, he said in 1967, as he himself had evolved from a man committed passionately to desegregation to a man passionately committed to a revolution of values and of humanity. He said in 1967, not too many months before he was assassinated, the majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. Now think about this. This is 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 3 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Not unlike this own moment of celebrating the second inaugural of the first black first black president. This is a moment for tremendous celebration. Think about all that work, that attempt to close the gap between the freedom left undone in 1863 and what they had achieved in 1964 and 65. And yet, King is complaining? Are you kidding me? Think about all the people who say, today, how could black folk, brown people, poor people complain about anything when you have not just a once elected, but a twice elected black president? There is nothing here to do but the heavy lifting of one's individual effort and ambition. Dream big, and you will achieve. But King saw through it. What cost him his life was not that he was a big dreamer. What cost him his life was that the nightmare of American inequality would not go away. He said, the majority of white Americans in 1967 consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. Sound familiar? They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. Sound familiar? But, he said, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. It is no surprise that poverty today, and you can Google this till your computer screens go dark after this speech, is as bad in 2013 for black and brown people as it was in 1967. Standing up for justice was the life that King led and that he committed himself to. Standing up for humanity and against dehumanization and human exploitation was the life that he led when he called the nation to account for her original sin and devaluing black life. Standing up for a moral universe against the politics of racial denial was the life that King led when he, surprising to every person in this room, I could bet you, challenged President John F. Kennedy to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation, because the first one had not done its work. Dr. King would today challenge us to continue to close that gap between the dream and the aspiration of freedom and the reality of a society that continues to promote freedom for some and unfreedom for others. Thank you very much for your time.
Two words of historical context. And now we will be taking question and answer, that Dr. Muhammad will answer some of your questions that you may have.
Go to the microphone.
You just have to come up to the microphone. We have one on the left. We also have some on the right side.
How can we ever close that gap?
Oh, well, first of all, you have to know what you're closing. Sorry. Thank you. So, if we take Dr. King, for example, what he was concerned about in 1967 was that racial equality, the right of standing in front of the bar of justice in this country that had essentially made illegal any form of segregation, was insufficient to the tremendous wealth inequality that he witnessed. And a country that essentially his economic system was deliberately designed to reward the few at the expense of many, but even more so that the distribution of income in America had clearly subsidized white life at the expense of black life. One timely example. Black folk who had experienced segregation for 3 generations since the 1890s, the very context that gave birth to Dr. King and the activism that he led. When black people went to work every day, they paid the same taxes and the same prices for the goods and services that existed in that society. Their tax dollars fueled the Montgomery, Alabama School District, just like the Montgomery, Alabama School District, just like the Jackson, Mississippi School District. And yet, by every possible measure, per capita, black folks had substandard everything, you name it. Less access, unequal, which eventually became the basis of the case in Brown versus Board of Education. Well, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act was insufficient to challenging overnight and changing the economic disparity that had long limited and marginalized black people in America. And so when I say today that poverty for those same groups is as bad now as it was then, the question remains, how free can you be in a capitalist society without resources to exist in that society, where inequality has truly grown? There is a larger visible black elite, there is a stagnant black middle class, and a very large, proportionately similar to the past, impoverished poor. It is, in fact, nominally larger simply because the entire population has grown. So that is the question. If King was motivated in the moment to close the gap between the possibility of equality against the reality of poverty and substandard living, well, if we still have the poverty and the substandard living, then it's up to young people to change the values in this country that will not allow, for example, politicians to run for offices without speaking to the experiences of most impoverished Americans, which is essentially our current state of affairs at every level of government. So politicians cannot represent your interests if you do not hold them accountable to your interests. Some of us, including those in this room as young people, not really interested in poverty. It's a drag. It's depressing. They're trying to get paid. They want to be successful. And I don't blame them for that. But just know that those aspirations reproduce the very basis of inequality in our society. So you have to decide what you want the world to be. Thank you. Yes?
I just wanted to know, like, how do you feel about, being that a lot of people are mixing races, of course, how do you feel about racism now from when it was before?
Well, that's a big question. I think I can put some of my sense of it. I'll say that, so there's a great book called Racism Without Racists. Do you know the book? It's written by a man named Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He's a sociologist. It's a good read. It's technical academic speak, but it's still a good read. The short version of this is that the mythologies of America being completely open society where racism no longer matters has produced a culture that looks for racism only in the image of a bigoted white Southerner or an N-word-using police officer. Let's just stop on the police officers, for example. You can actually be, in today's racism without racists, no different than the Irish beat cop of yesterday who had a particular beef with young black newcomers to New York back in the 1920s and 30s, and we would all understand that as racism. But what does it mean today that you might have a black officer or a Latino officer who is picking on innocent young children, 14 and 15-year-olds, going to and from school, disrespecting them and their authority, bullying them in the name of some kind of justice. Now, in today's terms, if you took this to the national stage where all the talking heads are, they say, that's not racism. How can it be racism? It was a black cop. It was a Latino cop. That's not racism. You know, those kids are in crime-ridden communities, and somebody's got to protect the good, law-abiding people of those communities, and so this is good policing. That's racism without racism. It is a racist policy. It is predicated on the notion that the entire group is criminal, and that some individuals might be subjected to certain forms of scrutiny is just the cost of doing public safety. So you have to decide what kind of humanity do you want to defend in this world, because we have a prison system that is fundamentally predicated on a form of social control, which is called punishment, essentially that takes gigantic groups of people who have no reasonable pathway to economic sustainability in our society. So it's not a surprise, for example, that as factories went away and the possibilities of economic participation in our society for people who were earnest and hardworking, but not necessarily wanting to be college graduates, do not have a reasonable expectations of a living wage in our society. And that the social self-safety net shrunk at precisely the moment when the jobs were going away, and then our politicians and our cultural conservatives decided that we should build as many prisons as we can to make sure that when all those people make bad decisions, or when we decide to pass laws to police vice, and vice is different than someone knocking you upside the head. Smoking pot is a vice. Drinking alcohol is a vice. Engaging in gambling or prostitution, forms of vice. All those are legal because the vast majority of this country says that's okay, with the exception of marijuana. Now you extend the analogy. Marijuana was distinctly criminalized or racialized as a Mexican first, black drug. Therefore, we have a set of policies in this country that are ostensibly colorblind. Racism without racism. Bad people get what they deserve. And no one can be held accountable because the Supreme Court has said the only measure of racism that we will respect in this society is when a cop calls you a nigger. Cop didn't call you a nigger, he was doing his job. If the cop's shooting at you or someone in your community and they're not yelling out the N-word as they pull the trigger, then it was reasonable suspicion. So you asked me my take on racism today as opposed to the past. There are no Klan hoods running around, just badges.
How do we address the fact that the 1% has the bulk of the wealth and that is impacting society in general?
So I believe that our tax codes, there are a lot of policy choices here, and I'm not going to pretend to be overly policy focused. I am primarily a historian of ideas and the relationship between those ideas and social patterns. But I will say this. We all know that in every community in this country, there is a race to the bottom to get jobs in our communities in exchange for tax credit, tax rebates, or no taxes to the companies that operate in those communities. Texas, for example, boasts very enthusiastically that it has been the engine of job creation in this country over the course of the Great Recession. Well, Texas, as many of you know, is a very low tax state. And as a consequence of that, they have essentially opened the doors to companies to relocate from other places in exchange for no taxes. In those other states that happen to be more developed states, states that once had large industrial manufacturing bases, the global economy has changed. Those factors were huge investments in what accountants, which I used to be one at Deloitte & Touche many years ago, called plant, property, and equipment. Costs a lot of money to maintain in an economy less dependent upon work happening here as opposed to in Latin America or in Asia or the subcontinent. Consequently, the low taxes in places like Texas put downward pressure on every state around for job creation. And job creation is a #1 political campaign issue. So I'm going to create jobs. So every Republican candidate, and well as the president, talked about job creation, talked about what they were going to do, and the Republicans believed in eliminating taxes. Well, who will pay for the infrastructure of our society where no one pays taxes? And in an increasingly regressive tax structure that shifts the tax burden to consumption, which is the tax you pay when you buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks as opposed to the tax you pay on your income, means that essentially at every level at the top, those decision makers are eliminating taxes from our society in the name of job creation. Well, let's say I eliminate the tax base in my community, new company moves in, who's going to pay for the schools? Who pays for the schools? The homeowners. Because now the business is no longer contributing to the community. The homeowners have to pick up the slack. And in exchange for what? Jobs? Or what kind of jobs? We know, for example, that the fastest growing jobs in America are low-wage jobs. They're in nursing, home care, they're in retail, they're in other low-level healthcare industries. And in a country where the minimum wage itself is a partisan issue, because many Republicans would like to see the minimum wage go away. Why? Because it raises the cost of doing business. What does this begin to sound like? What is the cost of doing business? If our priority is the cost of doing business, if that is the basis upon which we organize society, then we essentially say you have no guarantee of health care, you have no guarantee of schools, you have no guarantee of a minimum wage. What does that make you? A slave. It essentially says you can have a job and we'll pay you what we think you should be paid, and you'll have a quality of life that we think is sufficient for you.
Great.
That's the world we currently live in. Now, it's not explained that way. You have to be a little crazy to talk about that, in public. That's what it is. So you asked my opinion. That's my take on things. One last question. Are we done? Thank you all very, very much. Can we get another round of applause for Dr. These are some very powerful and insightful words.